Good evening and welcome. I'm Bill Brown with Brookings Mountain West. I appreciate your coming out tonight for the 12th Brookings Scholar Lecture in our series. We've had a busy year, and you're going to hear from Winston tonight, which is appropriate because Cliff kicked us off back in October, and he'll be introduced by one of my colleagues shortly. I just wanted to thank those of you who've been with us over these months. I see some familiar faces. I don't have a lecture to promote in the next week or two because this is the last one of the academic year, but we're hard at work picking out scholars for next year. So please stay tuned. We'll be advertising another program of lectures next year. And you're here for the public face of our Brookings scholars, but of course they work with our faculty and students in the classroom and on research projects. And you're going to hear a little bit more about that as they get introduced. But I want to acknowledge Brad Wimmer from our economics department who's here, who's worked with Cliff. And now I'd like to bring up to the stage Pushkin Kashru from our Transportation Research Center, who's working with Cliff and is going to introduce him. He's been working with one of his graduate students, Naveen, whoops, I lost your name here, Naveen Shleyan, and you're going to hear about what goes on behind the scenes here. Pushkin?
Okay, it's my pleasure tonight to introduce Dr. Clifford Winston, who since 1984 has served as a senior fellow in the Brookings Institution's Economic Studies program. Cliff is an applied microeconomist who specializes in the analysis of industrial organization, regulation, and transportation. Dr. Winston has also been co-editor of the annual microeconomics edition of Brookings Papers on Economic Activity. Prior to his fellowship at Brookings, he was an associate professor in the Transportation Systems Division of MIT's Department of Civil Engineering. He is the author of numerous books and articles. His articles have appeared in such journals as the American Economic Review, Econometrica, Review of Economics and Statistics, Journal of Economic Literature, Bell Journal of Economics, and the Rand Journal of Economics. Dr. Winston received his AB in economics from the University of California at Berkeley. That's where I'm from too. His MSc from London School of Economics and his PhD in economics from UC Berkeley in 1979. Now, my PhD graduate student, Naveen Shleyan, and I have been working on a project to study traffic management for past half a year with Dr. Winston. The framework of the problem statement and solution has been developed, and the first paper on one of the stages of the solution process should be complete during the summertime. And it's a great pleasure to be working with Dr. Winston and using his expertise, especially in econometrics, to study this problem deeply. Please help me welcome him to the stage.
I presented this material before at a conference that was sponsored by an international law firm that has my first name, actually. I won't say who it is, but you might be able to figure it out. And I was a couple of minutes into it, and one of the senior partners for the firm was sitting in the back and was sort of going, and so I stopped and said, well, it's clear that somebody wants to move for a summary judgment on what I have to say here. Let me just speak 2 more minutes, summarize what we have, and then we can go from there. And pretty much I got through maybe a couple more minutes after that, but it was largely about an hour and a half of discussion. I'm not quite sure if it'll go this way here, but I'm open to that. He certainly didn't get his summary judgment. I prevailed in the end, and he agreed. No, he won't say that. But let me go through this in the first 5 minutes is just opening motivation and summary of what I've got, and then I'll go through it, but certainly I'll be open for any questions and discussion very early on in this, a smaller group. So yeah, let's treat this more as a sort of this seminar discussion rather than sort of a formal lecture. I hope that's okay. All right. I'm not quite sure actually how I thought of this topic. This is not normally the kinds of things that I do, but I just thought of it, and I've been working on it with couple of colleagues, and the thing has actually just grown and grown, and it's actually going to be a short book when we're all done with it. But the basic idea is that there are a couple of factors both on the demand and supply side that have had effects that certainly have been beneficial to the legal profession, and we're looking at ways of now introducing more competition among lawyers. The issue isn't so much whether there are too many or too few lawyers in the United States. That's really incidental, although a number of people have been debating that. I'm not quite sure actually what the optimal number of lawyers are. I think the focus more is on competition. Okay, so in terms of motivation, lawyers or the legal profession is characterized by something that a number of professions have. It's called occupational licensing. There is actually entry into the legal profession that one must get, through satisfying various things, going to law school and passing a bar and so on and so forth. But what's interesting are the existence of people who have not gone through this but appear capable of providing very useful legal services. Probably the most famous example of this was the most requested expert on AskMeLaw.com, sort of a website that you go for legal advice. And he'd done very well. Actually, he or she, we didn't know who this person was. And then they found out who it was. And it was a 15-year-old high school student who'd never gone to law school, but was really good when people asked questions of going to the library and researching them and giving them answers that, to a first approximation, were quite accurate. And this obviously raised concerns among the American Bar Association, saying this person is not a lawyer, has not gone to law school, but is doing this and is guilty of unauthorized practice of law. So this obviously raised questions. Well, if he's providing a useful service and seems to be sort of providing things that are useful and correct, what's the problem of allowing this guy to provide this service as long as it's clear, what his credentials are? And there have been other examples of this, that people who provide specific legal services, and they're not lawyers, but people are happy with the kind of service they're providing, but they're not allowed to do this. So in theory, these people could provide useful competition, at least in certain segments of law. So the problem, as I said, can be summarized in terms of occupational licensing. That is, to do this, you need to get approval from the state. Now, there are a lot of professions where this is true. I mean, many of them. I mean, from getting work for plumbers, you need some kind of occupational license, electricians, so on and so forth. And the argument is one of quality, protecting quality, that these people have this credential, but the question is it really doing that? Do we need this kind of credential for quality? Or in fact, what it is just a barrier to entry and allowing people to raise prices. Now, an additional part on the lawyer side are also competition from firms. You can provide legal services as part of a law firm, but let's say you're working for an investment bank and you could provide not only hopefully some investment advice, but also some legal advice as part of that. That's not something that American Bar Association regulations generally allow. You have to be part of a law firm to be providing legal services. And the extent of entry on the part of firms also could be increased and generating competition on that side. So going into it, there are reasons to think that lawyers have some regulations that are working to their advantage, and the question is, are they really also providing benefits to the public? Now, a lot of the debate has been how lawyers have had effects on economic growth. So this is where the issue of the number of lawyers comes in, and certain economists have run some broad studies that have found that actually growth is negatively related to the number of lawyers. More lawyers leads to less growth. And the argument is that what you have are people who are seeking rents and trying to promote above average wages, and that's not good for an economy. As is all work, there's been responses actually by a law professor who redid the work and says, no, I'm getting a positive effect. As I said, we will have implications about the issues on growth, but whether there are too many or too few lawyers, as I said, will come out. It's not really clear what would happen in the world that we imagine. All right, so What then are the concerns that we really have in terms of these restrictions that appear to be on competition, both in terms of people who could enter and also firms? Okay, one are what we call economic rents. That is, people are getting wages that are above what free market competition would generate, and that leads to inefficiencies in the sense of what we call a welfare loss. That is, there are resources that are taken out of the economy with higher prices, in the same way that's also true for commodities. Second concern is a misallocation of labor. People tend to be attracted to industries where there are rents, and oftentimes then people's talents are misdirected. There is certainly a concern that Justice Scalia has said that we're attracting maybe too many people to practice law that should be doing something else, and that would be helpful in terms of the economy. And again, if the rents are high and people are attracted to these things, then that's certainly something we would want to address. Obviously, there are other areas where this problem may exist, but obviously with the financial crisis, they seem to be less of a problem now, e.g. Wall Street. All right, but then probably the more interesting part of all this is thinking about lawyers as an interest group. As all interest groups are, they have incentives to support things that are in their interest. And this is maybe the harder part to quantify, but certainly an important part, and that is the incentives to support particular policies that are certainly beneficial to lawyers and the legal profession, but may not be the kinds of things that are good for the general economy and the public. Okay, so with these kinds of concerns, the policies that we want to explore, and that's where we're talking about deregulation, are ways to introduce more competition into the legal profession, which would generally address these kinds of inefficiencies, as well as providing very little costs to the public. Okay, so I'm going to go through a mix of the empirical work that we've done on this, and this is different than the first lecture I gave was not so much quantitative as this one, generally trying to synthesize the literature. This is original work to it, but I'll try to make the thing as accessible as possible. And those who know a little bit more about it want to ask technical questions, that's fine. I can handle those and try to explain them in a non-technical way. Those of you who are not familiar with the kinds of empirical stuff that we're doing, I'm really going to talk about these things in a more qualitative way. Even though there'll be numbers up there, I'll try to explain them in ways that are somewhat intuitive, even though they may not connect with what's on the slide. Okay. All right, so just an overview of where the thing is going. So first, let me talk about the market for lawyers, just give you some basic institutional background about what we're dealing with. Then the first part of the empirical work is trying to estimate what we're calling lawyers' rents. So we want to actually quantify the assertion that these conditions that seem to be favorable to above average wages really are generating rents. Okay, and this gets into a rather critical part of economics about what we don't observe. So just prepare. The key part of the argument is people will argue there is something that is unobserved about lawyers that we're not going to be capturing in what we're doing. Unobserved ability, unobserved skills. Okay, and this is always a key part when trying to assess performance in labor markets. And so a lot of what we've got to do is try to deal with these unobservables. Okay. Then with that said, if we're arguing that in fact lawyers are earning rents, what's the story? Where are they getting them from? So we want to focus on the sources of rents, trying to quantify them and say, yes, we have a consistent story. They're getting inflated wages, and here are the things that are actually driving them, and can give us some sort of consistency and credibility with what the story is. And then after that, I'll go through then the policy implications and the argument for deregulation, try to increase competition. Okay. All right, so that's pretty much where I'm going. I'll go through now these various sections, but as I said, at any point anyone wants to raise anything, lights are bright, so it's really actually hard for me to see anybody. So if you're going like this, too bad. But shout out. I have no problem with that kind of thing. All right, so free entry at this point. What specifically, in terms of the institutional issues, are really what's at work here that are causing these imperfections in the market? Okay, first, the supply constraints. One, as I said, got to generally gain admission to an accredited law school. So something the American Bar Association will approve. Got to graduate from the law school, and you got to pass the state bar exam. Now, there are exceptions. Certain states have their own exam. You can become a lawyer as long as you just pass the exam. Certain states, if you go to their law school, you don't have to take their bar exam. So there are exceptions, but generally this is sort of the process by which it works. Now, where are the constraints in terms of limiting the supply of lawyers? Okay, well, it's pretty much at the law school stage. People who do go to law school, almost all of them, go on and pass the bar. Whether they choose to practice is their business, but the problem isn't really passing the exam so much as getting into law school. And in terms of the data that we looked at, it's about 50%. So if you look at the number of individuals who try to get in and the actual number of individuals who get in, it's about half. Okay, so a fair number of people are kept out from actually even going to law school in the US. Now, the argument could be, well, we just can't handle any more of them. We need more seats to accommodate prospective lawyers or embryonic lawyers, if you will. But there are constraints certainly on growing law school capacity. Existing law schools certainly are concerned with competing and getting good reputation. There's a lot of talk about US News and World Rankings, and they don't want to let in any more students than they have to, so to speak, because it might jeopardize their rating. New law schools could obviously help out, but again, they've got to be accredited by the American Bar Association. There are no online law schools that I'm aware of at this time, so you can't have that. So it's not so easy just to increase the seats, given, as I said, various constraints on law school capacity. At the same time, you've got one thing going on the supply side that's restricting supply. You've got pressures that are increasing demand. This is a key part of all this. That is, lawyers in government are obviously driving a lot of work and policies that certainly inflate the need for lawyers, whether it's environmental policy, intellectual property, liability, and so on. A lot of laws make it important and necessary, and we'll get into this more detail, for you to have a lawyer. So there's a lot of work going on in terms of regulations and what have you that will continue to increase the demand for lawyers at the same time that their supply is restricted. Imagine any market where that happens, you've got a supply that just isn't responding to increases in demand. Nothing is moving along with all that much, but there's pressures on demand. That's going to inflate price. Okay, so these just simple, basic forces would expect then wages to be inflated, okay, and that would generate what we call rents. Right? Okay, so now in terms of then the specifics of what we've actually got in terms of the people who are in the legal profession, here I'll give you just some basic summaries of what we got in terms of the number of lawyers. A variety of surveys where we do this, and we're talking about lawyers, certainly in law firm, that's the big chunk of them, but there's obviously lawyers in government and counsels, lawyers in the private sector working for corporations. And we got this out of the CPS Current Population Survey, and you can see this is not quite up to date, but we're hovering close to 1 million lawyers. So to a first approximation in the US, we have 1 million lawyers, okay? And been gradually going up, but the actual increase has been much slower in the latter part of 90s and 2000s than it was earlier. So there are increases in the supply of lawyers, but what we're going to be arguing, they haven't been increasing enough in responses to the rents that are earned. Here then we had to do a number of things to actually construct aggregate earnings for lawyers, because there's censoring in the CPS. What that means is the actual upper tails of income are not reported. They just say max out at, say, $200,000 a year. So we did a number of things to try to inflate these and get correct earnings. And what we have now are basically about, and these are just people who are lawyers, not anything related to legal services, paralegals or what have you, just actual lawyers. It's up to about 170 billion is what we were getting by the end, okay? So it's a pretty big chunk of money is just spent going lawyers. Obviously, it's probably a bit higher now, okay? And you compare with other countries, certainly as a percent of GDP, we're much higher than elsewhere. Okay. Now, what's been happening, though, to the distribution? This is obviously going to come up. Is it just some superstars who are making big money, and most lawyers really don't make all that much, and the rents are really not distributed throughout? It's only big ticket names that are getting big rents. Here's what we see in terms of the distribution of lawyers' earnings and what's been happening over time, and we see growth, if you will, in these left tails. Where's that pointer? Is this the thing? Well, anyway, not sure I'm not using that right. Anyway, if you could see, we have less and less at the lower tail. That's what this graph is saying. So the lower end, we're seeing increases in earnings, and only recently are we seeing the right tail, the high earners, actually go up too. Okay, so over time, the mean has been shifting. We're getting increases there. And even at the low end, we're getting increases. And only really recently at the upper end has the distribution sort of shown up at the higher tails. Okay, so over time, too, the distribution is not sort of working that it's just rich people or the rich lawyers that are getting it. So everybody seems to be in on it in terms of increases, and the average is going up. Okay, so with that as background, then the actual empirical work was trying to determine what we're calling the rents or inflated wages, if you will, that we get from these restraints, okay, on the supply side, and then increases in demand on the demand side. All right, so from a technical perspective, what we do in economics is, we have a price. In this case, it's earnings. And like all prices, these are going to be influenced by supply factors, okay, and demand factors. And then what's left over is what the occupation is going to give you. Okay, so imagine that we're going to survey people in all industries, all occupations, okay, and we want to sort of see how, if we put in supply factors and demand factors, just being part of that occupation, okay, is leading to effects on your wages, right? That is traditionally called rents, okay? Now, of course, there are other things that could be going on that we're not accounting for, that are left out, all right? And that's sort of, the skill, the science, if you will, of a lot of empirical work in economics is trying to account for these things, okay? And so that's what a lot of what we do in here is. But, we'll go through it basically with the simple things and then sort of try to go through then all the other possible stories to try to make sure that what we're truly capturing is really rents as opposed to other things that are left out that we can't measure, we can possibly observe. That could be the story as to why there's something about a particular occupation that's leading to higher rents. Okay, so on the supply side, these are all the characteristics of the worker, okay? Sex, race, education, work experience, age, employment status, all these kinds of things are going to enter into your effect on wages. Okay, on the demand side, you tend to think of things of technology, output per worker, and the technology like the capital labor ratio. Right, but now there's one immediate problem with trying to work with the demand factors, and that is we're putting in workers. That is the number of workers, output per worker, or the amount of capital divided by the amount of labor. Okay, what we're doing then is effectively holding those things constant. All right, and the reason why that's problematic in our context is because the argument that we're making is there's something about policy, restrictions on lawyers, that is working, if you will, to affect the supply. All right, so we don't want to have other things that are going to be soaking that effect up. All right, so this is an example of a rare case where you actually do not want to control for an effect in a statistical model, because that's going to sort of take away from the whole mechanism by which you're saying the rents are generated. So in other words, if I'm saying there's a mechanism that restricts supply, but then I use something else to, quote, hold supply constant, that's going to take away from my story. So actually, when I first do this, I do not want to include those demand variables in there, all right, because then they're going to take away from my story about the occupational dummies, right? I'll, of course, then also put them in and show you the difference, and they'll say something interesting. But generally, that's something you've got to be careful about. Okay, then when I'm calling out these dummies, are just indicator variables. They're going to tell me the occupation that the people are in. In this case, occupation industry is pretty much the same. Most, as I said, the bulk of the lawyers are for law firms, private sectors. And then, I've mentioned potential concerns, biases, things that are hard to measure. Okay, one of the things is effort. So argument is, well, lawyers get higher wages because they have to work harder, longer hours. Specialization, may want to control for certain types of legal work that gets higher paid. Ability, okay, which is oftentimes very difficult to measure, although you certainly can observe it. And skills, which is a big part now of the change in the distribution of earnings. Last few decades, the argument has been what really is driving the distribution of earnings in America, where the rich seem to get richer and the poor are poor, is unobserved skills and the big return for skills, for skill-biased technical change, like computers. So those people that have a particular skill, they're benefiting from this technological change, improvements in information technology and the like. But if you don't have those skills, you're left behind, okay? So it's these unobserved skills that are really what's important. If we're saying people are getting rents, no, it isn't. It's that they just have skills that we're not measuring. All right, so this is really up on the other side in terms of trying to argue that what we're capturing is really not rents, but other things that we're not capturing. All right, so as I said, our task is to go through all this stuff, okay, and try to convince you that, no, these things really aren't the story. All right, so what we did is we got data for several years, and we estimated this relationship for each year between 1975 and 2004. And I'm putting here a quote, a summary. Obviously, I'm not going to put up a table of these giant results. But basically, in terms of things that we observe, they would say very sensible things. Obviously, there's been improvements in returns for women now, less discrimination. So you see women making more, higher returns for college education, so on and so forth. When in fact, we did put in these capital labor ratio effects and output per worker, that did take things away from the occupational dummy for lawyers. When we left them out, the occupational dummy for lawyers had a bigger effect. But overall, what we saw, there are a number of industries where people were earning rent. So it wasn't just lawyers. Things where we did have entry barriers in a similar way, like in pharmacy, dentistry, and medicine, okay? And even economists, and I'll get back to that later, but we're in on this, and we're in on it big time for reasons that I think will become clear. All right, so certainly certification licensing really was at work from what we can say, okay? But there is something that's very distinctive about lawyers' rents that is going to tell me a story, I think, that makes it even clearer why we're really getting rents, okay? All right, so as I said, what the models do is they estimate what just the effect, holding other things constant, of being in occupation does. And here's where we have our now summary of what we've got for lawyers' earnings premiums. That's sort of the nice way of calling it, or rents, okay? And we see that basically what we have is thing growing over time. There was certainly some, volatility to the effect, but we started roughly at premiums of 25%, and by the end of the sample, where in the dark blue was lawyers, we're up to close to 50%, okay? Now, we compare that with physicians, okay, who also have obviously a very strong licensing requirement, okay? And consistently, the physicians were always above lawyers, so they're earning more in terms of premiums, okay? But what was also true is they did not seem to have sort of a general increase. You could fit a line and sort of see that we're having an increase in rent. So it's a very distinct pattern about what lawyers have, okay? So this is not to certainly say that what the doctors have can't be interpreted as rent. It can, okay? But there's something distinctive about the pattern of rents for lawyers that we're going to want to explain, okay? But overall, this is what we're getting. The increases from 25 about 50%, and it's been growing. All right, now, in terms of what we call the distribution of rents, I showed you a diagram before that showed the distribution of wages. Okay, this is a little harder technically, but basically what this table is showing is, in fact, lawyers at all levels of earnings have getting higher earnings premiums. People at the lowest end, the 25 percentile, they had premiums of 0.21, and they're up now to 0.44. And we generally see a similar pattern for most of the earnings distributions, except for the higher end, they went up from 0.407 to 0.7. So as a percentage, you see probably the bigger increases in 25, 50, and 75 percentiles, but of course in absolute terms, the people at the highest ends are earning the most. But everyone is basically in on it. It's hard to make an argument at this point that the distribution of the rents is located just in a certain group of lawyers. It's pretty much everywhere throughout the distribution. Okay. All right, now, this then is the work, if you will, of trying to go through the argument as to why we really are picking up rents and not picking up other effects. Okay, first, in terms of effort, the best way we could try to measure this is annual hours of work. And just looking at the actual data, again, our interest now is why these rents are growing over time. And we pretty much saw stable hours for associates, some increase for partners, but if we actually then try to see what happens if we put annual hours into the model, would that affect our estimate of this earnings premium or return to occupation? It had a little effect. So it was pretty hard for us to see that these rents and their growth over time, and that's now going to be the focus, is why these things have been growing, really could be explained by hours of work. We just didn't see it in the data, either in terms of just the raw data or even put it in the model. We also then focused on areas of specialization where the idea was, well, maybe it's really lawyers in particular specializations that have a lot of government work and high-level corporate work, New York, Boston, and DC. So we just looked at a subsample of lawyers, of workers in that area, redid everything, and try to figure out what the occupational rents of lawyers are. And we got, again, a similar story. So we didn't really see much in just focusing on areas of specialization. In terms of ability, we focused on changes in LSAT scores, and even though these things are standardized, we looked at ways of making sort of comparisons over time. We didn't see much in terms of changes. And GPA, there were some, but accounting for grade inflation, it was, again, hard to say that we really saw substantial increases in ability. Another sort of thing that we did is we try to look at the effect of experience, and if in fact there have been improvements in ability, we would think that experience would matter less over time, because then that was being taken away. It wasn't experience that was so important, but newer people coming in were more able, and so we expect then the effect of experience on wages to be less. Again, we didn't see that kind of thing. So a number of ways of trying to look at ability couldn't really turn up much. Okay, now the hard thing is probably the skill bias, because this is a big part of what labor economics literature has been talking about, now for the last couple of decades. What returns, have been at work here, and lawyers certainly could have been a part of this. And what is it about lawyers that may be different from other workers? What would be similar? Okay, so most of the earnings premiums that I mentioned from other occupations tended to be stable. Okay, but there were exceptions, and those exceptions are interesting in terms of their patterns. Have to be explained in a way that may or may not be the same as what's going on with lawyers. For example, pharmacists, they tend to have also growing increases in rents. So we wondered, well, was there anything that happened during our sample period that may have been working to affect pharmacists in a way that may be different from what's going on with lawyers? And there was an introduction now of what they call the PharmD, which is a higher degree, if you will, more years in going to graduate school or pharmacy school. And again, you're constraining supply. So there was a mechanism in a similar way that's been going on in the case of lawyers, okay, for pharmacists that could possibly account for their increases in rents. Dentists, just the opposite. This has gotten attention. There's been actually considerable closing of dental schools. Again, that's also then had their effect on restricting supply. And as I mentioned, economists have been later in the sample showing increases in rents. And I think the story there, interestingly enough, is our greater alliance with lawyers. That is, when I went to graduate school and went out on the market, very few, if any, economists that I knew took jobs actually in consulting firms. I hardly even knew of any, let alone know of any people that did work for consulting firms or provided litigation-based support. But that has obviously changed quite a bit. And now, probably as much as 20–25% will go work for consulting firms and do litigation-based support, working for lawyers, and certainly getting a lot more money than they get from their academic jobs, and some do both. So in a sense, it's really been the economists' association with the lawyers through consulting that's been helping them. They've been in on it. So these factors would show that whatever was going on with lawyers, it was distinct in other occupations where there were growing rents, which is important because there had to be some sort of story that wasn't sort of taking everybody and sort of maybe some other possible effect. So then we turn quickly to, okay, what is it that's at work? Right? What exactly is it that's causing lawyers' premiums to go over time? And here, we then can focus on both supply and demand. Okay, first would be the licensing constraint. Okay, and we could test that very simply by just looking at what has happened to rents over time as we increase, or not increase, just allow the number of lawyers to change over time. Okay, so normally what you'd expect is more workers in an occupation would reduce wages. Okay, as you increase supply of a particular worker in occupation, there are more of them, that's going to bid down their price. Okay, when we explored that relationship in the case of lawyers, we found just the opposite. Okay, we had a positive effect. All right, and the story there is that lawyers were being introduced in a way that was limiting what we call free riding. Okay, so they were being organized still as a powerful interest group, and if anything, just marginal increases in lawyers were affecting their political power as an organized group and putting pressure on particular policies that were of their interest. So this was sort of a perverse result. Generally, anything else you'd see more workers in occupation, rents are going down, or wages would be going down. We found the opposite. So certainly that was one effect that appeared to be going on. Okay. Now, certainly in terms of how this works in practice, well, what's interesting is so many of the people who actually then are making laws are lawyers. Both the regulatory agencies, members of Congress, so many of them come from the legal profession, and of course, judges too come from the legal profession. And there's a common way of thinking. So certainly when lawyers make arguments, people can understand this. This is kind of their way of thinking, where it comes from. This kind of symbiotic relationship, obviously, is quite helpful. All right, now in terms, though, then of specific policies, we wanted to explore that. So if there are certain things that seem to be changing in terms of policy that are inflating demand for lawyers and helping them, certainly we should be able to identify them. So what we did is we wanted to see how the rents were affected over time by certain policies which had measurable things that would be affected over time. Okay, one would be regulations, right? As there are more regulations, there are going to be more lawyers. Okay, certainly we create a change in financial regulations. I'm sure that there's going to be a lot more work for lawyers. And certainly, obviously, the work going on investigating kind of practices that investment banking firms have been in is going to help provide increases in employment for lawyers. Many other examples could be given. So we want to look at how federal agency employment had been affecting rents over time as measures or proxies, if you will, for economic regulations. Another one was intellectual property. There was a major change in the laws in 1982 about patenting, and there was a giant increase both in patent awards and in patent suits, okay, obviously increasing demand for lawyers. As we noted actually in our work, that most of these things now are written by lawyers, because a lot of, when they're going to be contested, they're going to be in court. So lawyers have now had sort of an increased role over time in intellectual property. And of course, liability, which has gotten a lot of attention, and then obviously the cost of the tort system. Okay, so increases in various sorts of lawsuits, again, increasing demand for lawyers. And then we had controls for other variables, corporate transactions. So, you know, in a broad aggregate sense, we see things changing over time that certainly are policies that are increasing demand for lawyers. Okay, I'm not necessarily saying that these things don't provide any benefits, but they certainly could be at work in increasing rents. All right, so here. All right, actually I'm going to go back on this. So what we did is we fit relationships that try to explain our rents by these various measures, and found, interesting enough, for lawyers that these were strong positive relationships. You know, more regulatory employment, greater rents, more patent awards, greater rents, liability system, more rents. But then we did the same thing for the other occupations where they had rent increases and got very different results. In the case of doctors, you know, more liability, that didn't help them, that's for sure. Patents, though, did, in terms of innovations that presumably were helpful to doctors in expanding technology and, of course, more costly healthcare. Regulations did nothing. Dentistry, you know, not too much. Pharmacy, you know, very, very weak relationships. Interesting enough, for economists, in the first part of our sample, very weak relationships, but by the latter part, we were getting things that paralleled the effects for lawyers. So reinforcing the idea that economists are benefiting through their consulting from the inflation in wages and rents to lawyers. All right, so we now have a relationship between policies and rents. Our question was, okay, you know, quantitatively, could this explain what's been going on over the past few decades? All right, so what we wanted to do then is explore, well, suppose there were changes in policy, all right? So we're arguing that these policies were helping to inflate lawyers' rents. Then, as you'll recall from October in my first lecture here, government failure versus market failure, right? These policies also are not particularly helpful in terms of efficiencies. A lot of the regulatory things were obviously costly. Tort costs can be bad. And the net benefits of the patent system are still something we're struggling with, whether they really are doing any good. So it's not like these things are great things for the overall economy. That's certainly something that's open for debate, that's for sure. And so we say, okay, suppose we cut back on these policies. We want to phase in reductions of federal regulatory employment. What would that do for rents? Okay, suppose that tort costs do not grow like they have grown in the past, but much slower, closer to the rate of GDP at that time. Okay, and then similarly for patent awards, yes, there'll be some increases in patenting because of improvements in information technology, but they certainly would not have gone up the way they did from the '82 Act. So we run simulations where we're making assumptions that are cutting back on policies that we think are inflating rents for lawyers. You know, what would happen? And you know, these are the kinds of simulations that we get. Basically, we look at what rents we got originally from our equation, and then we have these various scenarios where we cut back on torts, we cut back on patenting, we cut back on regulatory employment, both individually and collectively. And you see, I think the bottom one is the important one. You know, we estimate our rents on the order of 0.22. We phase in all these cutbacks, and we're pretty much back where we were, near 0.28. So the point of all of this was to say that what government is doing has been aiding and abetting lawyers. all right, with a lot of policies that have been helpful both to inflating their wages. Okay, at the same time, these policies have arguable efficiency improvements. All right, and again, the symbiotic relationship doesn't hurt. Members of Congress, many of them certainly have law degrees. Half of the presidents, law degrees. Yeah, and so on and so forth. Comments, questions?
The curves that you showed, the plots over time, I'm guessing the present value it's been normalized for the value of money over time.
Well, in terms of maybe rents are just percentages. Okay, so, right, so I don't have to do anything about that.
The curve which showed the amount of money they earn.
Oh yeah, they're real, they're real.
They were actually.
Oh yeah, sorry, they're real dollars.
They were not normalized for.
No, they're in real terms, absolutely. And real, the latest year of our thing, yeah, sure. Yeah. Shout, because I can't see much.
Oh, I'm sorry. This shows the effect of reducing the demand drivers on economic rents of lawyers, but it doesn't show any effect on supply side.
Absolutely.
With regards to, did you do anything with regards to that? If you added another 100,000 lawyers into the system by increasing law schools or those types of things?
Yeah, what we wanted to do, that's right, we didn't want to simultaneously confound the issue, so to speak. So we separated things out in terms of the demand effects. And on the supply side, the difficulty there is back to the point that I made earlier, is, quote, the perverse relationship. Remember, numbers of lawyers have positive effects on earnings. All right, so I didn't think we wanted to go through that and try to make the argument that cutting lawyers back, even though that would reduce earnings according to our relationship there, that obviously as a practical matter is not going to work. But certainly if anything, all that's going to do is increase wages, just cutting things back further. So
you're not suggesting that deregulating how to become a lawyer as much as you're suggesting we should maybe change government policies not to reward them so much.
Well, we'll get to that, but here the thing that I see that deregulation is going to affect is that estimated coefficient. That is the sign of that thing. All right. See, what my concern is that positive relationship. I want to flip that sign, okay, and have it work in the way that one would normally expect a market to work. That is, more supply should reduce prices. So the argument will be certainly that what we need to do is break that. All right. On the demand side, the argument would be, just a preview, we've got to make policies more efficient. Okay. But I'll pull in the political economy of the reality of what one really would be the more reasonable way to go. But that's what's at stake. So it's really that perverse relationship that's the troubling part of all this. But it is certainly consistent with a well-organized, powerful interest group that's limiting free riding. They'll let enough people in to generate power as a group, but they don't want a whole bunch of people in that are taking some of the pie, but they're really not adding anything to it. It's what's called tenure. Yeah.
Can you just discuss a little bit actually how you did the simulations for this?
Yeah. So we went back earlier, going back earlier, sorry. We had this relationship over time between lawyers' rents based on the estimates of their occupational premium and these possible influences over time, changes in agency employment, patents, so on and so forth, and a number of other control variables, okay? So we fit that statistical relationship, okay? Use that to then predict, what earnings, rent premiums would be. It's pretty close to the dependent variable, but not exactly, okay? Then armed with that, we would go through these various scenarios. So we'd cut back on, quote, the X, in this case, the effect of the regulatory employment, scale that back, okay? Hold the other influences constant, repredict what the rents are, okay? And do the same thing for each of them. And that's pretty much then what you've got here.
So those are statistical predictions?
Yes, absolutely.
So
Absolutely. Yeah, and statistical predictions based on the original relationship between rents and the policies. Okay. So, remarkably enough, earnings premiums that were estimated certainly separately and moving over time, correlated quite well with policies that were having effects that in principle could be affecting those rents. But again, I want to emphasize, this was true for lawyers, but not certainly true for every other occupation. In fact, it wasn't true for any of them. In certain cases, you had a couple of things that were working for you, but not all of them. And as I said, economists were in on the end. Yeah.
Was this a linear regression or the nonlinear effect?
Yeah, no. It was straight time series. Yeah. I don't think there was anything to look up for higher order things. Okay. All right. So, that's really sort of the core of the circumstantial evidence, if you will, both the existence of rents, sources of rents, and most importantly, certainly the inability really to tell other stories that seem to explain them, and was already mentioned. Then, okay, where do we want to go on this? All right. Well, obviously we could tackle the demand or supply side or both. We first consider ways to improve policies that would reduce demand for lawyers. Now, obviously, the objective of policy would not to be to reduce the demand for lawyers. The objective would presumably to make the policies more efficient. Environmental policy, cost of the tort system, reform of intellectual property. There have been minor steps in that direction, but let's face it. Again, source. The first lecture I gave, government reform, is very, very difficult and very slow. If anything, the areas where we see major government reforms that are effective is when they get out, basically deregulation and privatization. But it is rare that within the existing framework, we actually see fundamental reforms of policy that provide demonstrable benefits. Now, obviously, we'll be examining what the effects of healthcare are, okay? But from an economic point of view, the question will be, the cost of really achieving what's been achieved. So both in terms of actual improvements in access to health care and the cost of doing it, people will obviously be measuring that very closely. The effects of financial regulatory reform, when that comes to pass, we have a financial regulatory protection group, what that's going to do. It's obvious what my priors are. It's not going to amount to anything, but let the evidence speak. In general, though, it's quite hard to reform these things, and certainly would take a long time to do it. So I don't really see this as the way to deal with the issues that have been motivated here in the legal profession, is just say, well, the government just got to do better things. Well, that's just not going to happen right away, if at all, depending on how you see these things. So my focus was not on the demand side at all. The focus is really on the supply side, okay? And again, that was pointed out, what we really want to do is we want to change that sign of that relationship simply between the number of lawyers and rents. I want it negative, okay? So first thing is, okay, if we allow for free entry, what about the motivation for why we had the entry restrictions in the first place? Now, I didn't go into this, but there really is an interesting history about how this worked. Lawyers, of course, were not regulated when we first had legal practice in America. A large part of the problem was those legislators that would have to do this would basically say that they're not qualified because they didn't come from accredited law schools. All right, so certainly there was that sort of public interest, concern on their own interest, if you will. But gradually, as people went to law schools, could be accredited, then they would go ahead and sort of restrict entry into the profession. This is sort of a classic argument that Milton Friedman made in Capitalism and Freedom. So this was not something that really was born clearly of quality because no one really knew at the time. There was no demonstrable evidence the lawyers that were in practice were bad lawyers and that we really needed to restrict entry of lawyers. And even over time, it's not clear, how important the ABA is in terms of disciplining lawyers to enhance quality and so on and so forth, okay? But also I think what's changed is the available evidence to assess competence. There's a lot of things certainly people could use. If degrees and credentials are important, obviously the market can determine that. It's not clear to me why we need restrictions on doing that. Also, there are a lot of competent people, at least in terms of measured ability, scores and what have you, that are currently prevented from practicing. I mean, there are differences in terms of the statistical differences between GPAs and LSATs are very, very small in terms of people who are in. So then you look at people who are providing legal services all along, they're breaking the law with unauthorized practice, are doing it. One wonders, what really would be the downside of allowing entry? Provided credentials were made clear, certification is something that could be offered, so that again, the market could determine that. If people thought that it was important for lawyers to be certified to be doing certain things, whether it be corporate work, marital work, wills, what have you, that could be provided, and then you could say, I'm certified to do this. But again, the market's determining that. You're not required to do it. If you're looking for a lawyer, you want to make sure they're certified in a particular area of competence, you could check that out, okay? So I don't see any argument really that the quality has been, greatly increased to the point where the information wouldn't be available on the demand side. In terms of additional competition from corporations, again, not clear what the problem is. The alleged argument is conflict of interest. Let's face it, we have this, throughout corporations. So I don't see why we couldn't have, investment banks, providing legal services along with what other services they're providing to compete with law firms. So we get an additional source of competition there. Okay. Now, what I see is a number of things. Obviously, there'll be probably significant efforts to differentiate products. So those lawyers that really see they're providing a very, very high quality skill that very few people could provide, I'm sure there's no doubt they'll argue that or try to either advertise that or make that known to people or build on their reputation. And they may be able to still get the premiums they're getting. But certainly I think there'll be variations in lots of other areas where we start seeing other people coming in, competing, and reducing wages in that way. So that's what I would expect. Certainly there'll be questions of people whether they want to be incurring the debt going to law school and then not being able to get the earnings that people once made in that area. So that obviously could have allocations for laborers. And of course then on the political economy side, any incentives to oppose policy reforms, whether it be patent liability, there'll be less because there's less that you're going to be getting out of doing that, to pursuing that rent. So the vision that I see of all of this is certainly a much greater variation in prices, certainly a reduction in the mean, probably a variation in quality in terms of what you can get, but again, you might have a quality that's better tailored for really the work that you do. Do you really need a high-priced lawyer to do something that could be done by a paralegal? Okay, and obviously that's an issue that's even coming up now. All right, so I see that there's potentially substantial improvements both in resource allocation from doing this with very little downside. Okay, now this is not something that people are unaware of. I don't think that people are focusing so much on a deregulation perspective, but there certainly have been certain dissatisfactions with availability of lawyers and legal services, and we are seeing some signs of change. So there's been growing interest in what they call the justice cap. Okay, that there's certain people that just don't even have enough access to the legal system, and they want to increase legal aid. Okay, and ways of doing that are often having people who really aren't lawyers but are able to provide service, whether it be people in law school or just law students or even paralegals. So there's been certainly interest in doing that, which is, in a form of the kinds of effects that you would expect to see in a fully deregulated market. Okay. Then certainly there's interest in reducing the cost of legal services, discussion of end of billable hour. Ways of been doing that, again, are trying to get people who are non-lawyers to do a bigger chunk of the work. Concerns certainly about outsourcing, reducing the cost of the work. So again, these are things that are moving in the direction of deregulation, certainly far short of it, but certainly then opening up the possibility that, yes, maybe we're really onto something, that there need to be ways of reducing costs. I'm suggesting something that just would be much stronger. Okay, now, where we really start to see the sources of reform, and that's actions at the state level toward unauthorized practice of law. That is, they're not going along with them anymore. They say, we're just not going to enforce that. There are a few states in the US where that's going on. This state has a chance to be one of them. And if you want to see a parallel for deregulation, the examples are obviously airlines. That's how we had it, right? California and Texas basically had unregulated airline competition, okay? And then a lawyer, interestingly enough, in 1965 said, I think I'll figure out what the difference is between fares between intrastate California routes, LA and San Francisco, and interstate airline routes between Washington, D.C. and Boston, basically same distance, found the fares a lot higher on the interstate route and said the only thing that could explain this is regulation, okay? And sure enough, I think it was the California experiments effectively, and Texas too was another one, that really showed what happens when we allowed competition that was enough to convince policymakers. And this really would be the route to go, is start thinking of individual states exploring, do we really want to enforce unauthorized practice? Can we explore cases where we now allow people of varying sorts of backgrounds, but not necessarily law degrees and even passing a state bar exam, to practice, and start seeing what effects that has, both on access to the system and overall wages, all right? My sense is that if this is going to get anywhere, it's the only way it's going to go. Certainly we're not going to have anything at the federal level, and obviously, there's going to be resistance to this as there is in all fundamental changes. But if you take the lead and we start seeing what it is, then that's really how this could happen. So I'm going to stop there and let's have more discussion.